Hey everyone, in this tutorial we're going to see how we can set up various kinds of layouts in a PDF report using the simple Hybiscus JSON API. So in our first example over here we have a very simple PDF report. We have a section component as our very first component, and within that we have placed 3 card components. In this case we have set the columns to null on the parent section component, and that is the default setting as well. And we can see what Hybiscus will do in this case. It will automatically try to place all of those child components side by side together onto one single sort of a row. And so that means that we have very flexible sort of an auto layouting feature. So if we were to add an additional card over here, we'll see that it will automatically squeeze them all side by side, equally dividing up the width of the reports. So this is the behavior if we have columns set to null. We do not control how much each width of each component, it just automatically tries to fit them in. However, we can take advantage of the width key on the components to try and manually tell Hybiscus how much space they should occupy. So we'll go ahead and try that. So we'll say we want half the width for the first card, and then for the next 2 cards, we can specify a quarter of the width. And if you go ahead, press Control Space to generate that PDF, and you can see now we have a slightly different layout. We have half the width for the first card and then a quarter for the next 2. So this is how you can try and vary the layout a little bit. If we go to our next example, we'll see what happens if we set the columns key to a value such as 4. In this case, what Hybiscus will do is it will divide up this section into a grid with 4 columns. And so now we can see that we have actually placed 6 components over here. And so since we have a grid with 4 columns in each row, it doesn't matter that we have more than 4 card components. It will automatically place them into each sort of cell or column of that grid. So we have the first 4 columns of the grid occupied, and then we'll just repeat that onto the next row. And so we can basically keep on repeating that behavior, and we'll actually see Hybiscus will just continuously populating those cards for us. So that is the behavior if we set a value for columns. Now let's look at another example over here where we can take advantage of just setting the columns to 1. So when we set the column to 1, that means that every single child component basically behaves like its own row. But if within that row we want to have further components, further child components in different arrangements, we can use a special component known as the row component, which we've used over here, which within itself we can add some more components and have different layouts within each one of those rows. So the row component is similar to a section component, but the difference is that there is no sort of title that is placed on top of it. It is basically a blank empty component which we can use options such as the columns key within it again. So if I go ahead over here, I can set columns to actually something like 1. And so then go ahead and create this PDF again. We'll see now the first row actually has only 1 column in that grid, and so then our 3 card components need to be actually stacked on top of each other because each one of them can only occupy 1 column at a time. But actually if we go back and we set that to 4, then it behaves more like a normal row. So then we have essentially 4 spaces available in that first row, and then each child component will only occupy 1 column at a time. However, we can also, as we have seen over here, where we have the column on our very top level component set to 1, then we have this behavior over here where we add multiple rows, they basically stack on top of each other. And so then we can have on each row a slightly different behavior. So over here where we have in our second row, we've taken advantage of the width key as we saw earlier. And we have sort of like a masonry grid now being set up where we have, a half width in the center and then quarter width on the edges. So this is how you can start to mix and match components and have different widths, different sizes, and create all sorts of different layouts that you might need within your PDF report. And then finally, we'll see our last example where we want to actually put two section components side by side. So again, we have used the row component, but the row is now our top level component. So we've placed the two sections inside of it. And since we have not set the columns value to anything, it is by default to null. And so then Hibiscus will automatically try to put these section components side by side next to each other. But over here, we have actually gone and set the width to a quarter. So that's why our section is occupying just 1/4 for the left side and then 3/4 for the right side. But if I were to go ahead and delete the width key on each of these components, we'll see Hibiscus will by default try to evenly spread out these two components, so they occupy roughly half the width by default. So I hope this illustrates the power of the row components, but as well as using the width and columns key and how you can achieve different layouts that you might need in your PDF report.